Okay, so we are now moving on to question 4, the last question of section A in language paper 2. This is a 16-mark question. It carries the most number of marks per question in section A, so this is a crucial question for you to gain those marks. The exam board recommend that you spend 15 minutes on this question. That's just a suggested timing. However, I would recommend that if you have the time to spend 20 minutes, if not even a few more minutes than this, then do it, okay? If you have those minutes spare, use it for this question because, as I said, it is a very, very crucial one. So, in this question, you will be looking at source A and source B, and you'll be comparing these two texts. So the question is, or the task is, to compare how the writers convey their similar perspectives on cycling in the city. Now, it is obviously asking you to look for similar perspectives. It could be different perspectives if the two texts are very different. But in general, it's used that word similar because the perspectives are similar, aren't they? They're looking at, or they're talking about how cycling can be dangerous due to the reckless drivers on the roads. They kind of portray cyclists in a similar way. There are more similarities than differences, so that's why that word has been used. However, we know through our comparative poetry and just by having an understanding of this word compare, that this means to look for similarities and differences. So don't be afraid to look at differences as well between these two texts. Okay. So in your answer, you could, this word really should be should, because you need to be doing all of these things. Compare their similar perspectives on cycling in the city, so their viewpoints on cycling. You are comparing the methods the writers used to convey these perspectives, and you are supporting your responses with references, quotations, in other words, to both texts. Now, when it comes to the methods, this means obviously to look for language across both texts. So whether that's linguistic, looking at your verbs, your adjectives, adverbs, etc., etc. But also things like metaphors, hyperbolic language, maybe repetition, things like that. So language is something you can discuss. The tone of the writers is also a method, and you have done a bit of planning on that anyway. So you can compare the humorous tone of the writer in source B compared to the more serious tone, the more imploring tone of the writer in source A. You could also talk about structure here as well. So the way in which these texts have been put together, the way that they have been organised, and just to give you an example of that, you could briefly mention how Walker is building an argument throughout his writing. He's building an argument in order to end with a moral view when he says, remember that they are human beings. So you don't need to have a whole paragraph about structure, but somewhere in your answer, if you use phrases like the writer begins with this, the writer ends with this, the writer develops their ideas, you are talking about structure. All right, so I would recommend writing 4 paragraphs for this question. I will probably write 3 myself because I know that I am a writer who likes to write in a very detailed way. So I know that from experience, I will just write 3 paragraphs because I know that I can write developed ones, but you may look for 4. You are doing your point, your evidence, and your analysis, okay? Within this analysis, you need to also be talking about the effect on the readers. And I'll show you an example of that in just a moment. I've managed to do a quick plan before I have started. I recommend that you do the same. Might not be as detailed as this, but I'd recommend just writing a list of similarities and differences between the two sources. And as you can see, I've got a lot more points for similarities, which is expected because the question is talking about similarities in general, but I've still got a few differences that I can talk about. The first point that I can make is just one that we know: drivers being inconsiderate and reckless on the roads. And I might just add that both use flashbacks or quick anecdotes about their personal experiences to show this. I might jot down that whereas source A uses a humorous tone and hyperboles to describe the drivers, source B has a more serious tone. So if you can just jot these down to help you, then do so. But as I said, you might not have time to. The second point that I can make is that cyclists risk being physically harmed. Might jot down a few quotations. So source A, he says flesh and bone, and in source B, she described the sandwich, the human driver sandwich that she risks being on the roads. They also talk about solutions to overcoming their problems. In source B, she talks about the book and the manual, and in source A, he talks about the police revamp and the changes to driving tuition to protect cyclists. You could talk about the conflicted relationship between the drivers and the cyclists. It's both, quite a hostile relationship between the two. So you could talk about that. And finally, we've got the fact that both sources draw attention to cyclists' rights. Now, I've just written these down really, really quickly. But as you can see, this is 5 bullet points. I'm not going to have time to cover all of these, so I might just choose 3 in which I can make 3 developed paragraphs from. So what I'm going to do now is just write you a beginning paragraph for this question. I'm going to focus on my first point here, that drivers are inconsiderate and reckless. And then I will be asking you to finish off this response with another 2 to 3 paragraphs, depending on how much time you have today. Okay, so as I'm starting off with a similarity, I'm going to use a comparison phrase to start off with, that both writers demonstrate how cycling on the roads can be dangerous due to the reckless vehicles. So both writers demonstrate how cycling on the road can be dangerous due to reckless drivers. Really nice, clear comparison point. I'm going to be focusing on the drivers here and their behaviour. So, how do they do this? And which quotations can I use here? Now, I can actually recycle some quotations that I've already used for question 2. The quotation about being overtaken very closely. I've also noticed that this paragraph about being overtaken very closely was actually a flashback as well. So if you can bring in anything else in terms of methods, in terms of structure, then do mention that. So Walker uses a flashback of being, that word should be being overtaken very closely. By a car, only for him to catch up with the driver at the next junction. Okay. So I might develop this and talk about how the drivers are being portrayed or depicted here. And just continue this a little bit more. So he depicts the drivers as reckless and taking risks. Spurred on by a desire to overtake and quicken their journey. Overtake the cyclist. And make their journey quicker. However, so talking about another quotation that I can use here, what is Walker's view on this risk-taking behaviour, this reckless behaviour? There is a metaphor that he uses towards the end. He describes this overtaking as a brief victory, so I will bring that in here. So, however, Walker uses metaphorical language in brief victory. So he's saying that this behaviour is pointless, in other words. To show how pointless and silly what is he saying is silly? To treat driving as if it was a race, essentially. So how pointless and silly it is to treat driving like a race and disregard the safety of cyclists.